Hi, everyone. We're almost done wrapping up, so super excited to be here. And just as an intro, I'm Ashley from WGSN. And today, we will be talking about consumers and creativity. So if everyone wants to take a picture of the QR code, you can download our recent report on future consumers and creativity related to emotions. But just to give you a quick intro, WGSN is a trend forecasting company, one of the leading trend forecasting agencies in the world. And I had someone ask me before, do I forecast the future with my crystal ball? The answer is no. But today we'll talk a little bit about what's going to be happening in 2027 and some strategies and ways that you can think about consumer mindsets in the years to come. So what we do at WGSN is we look at macro drivers. And one strategy is to actually zoom out. So I think we've had a lot of super interesting conversations today about what's happening in the fashion world now, kind of things about influence, social media, et cetera. But what I want to uncover today is almost why is that happening? Where is that coming from? So we at WGSN look at a lot of the societal shifts, what's happening in the world, and how that impacts consumer trends. This is a little bit about what we'll be talking through today in terms of what's happening in society, technology, environment, politics, industry, and how that really impacts our behaviors and what we do in our day-to-day lives. So when we transport ourselves 2 years into the future, 2027, what we're projecting is this era of and. At the moment, and in recent years, it's really been I'm this or that. It's either kind of light or dark, natural or technology. But into 2027, we're going to see it's light and dark. And we see a lot of consumers adopting kind of multiple identities. What I really want us to deep dive into and link to this idea of creativity is emotions. And I think what's really interesting when we look at creativity is emotions are a catalyst for creativity and also a product of creativity. And if we look at kind of consumer behaviors, it's reported that on average we experience about 400 different emotions a day. So as we go through this, I think just check in with yourselves and think about what emotions you've experienced today kind of in the past week and see how that's impacted and shaped your behavior. We're going to deep dive into 6 if we have time. It'll be a bit of a quick pace. But first, in society, we see a shift towards we and me. And what's happening in society, I love this quote from Dan Zavi. He's a philosopher in Copenhagen, and he talks about how in order for us to be connected as a we have to celebrate each other's differences. And I loved the panel discussion about kind of embracing yourself, really being true to yourself, because that really is how we collectively become a whole. And so what does that look like in relation to emotions? There's no question that with the kind of mental health epidemic, what people are feeling, there's a higher percentage of people experiencing loneliness, and that's obviously an emotion. But how can we use creativity to counteract that? At WGSN into 2027, we're looking at emotions. So today, people are experiencing lonely, they're being overwhelmed kind of in the state of the world. And into 2027, what emotions do people want to feel more of? They want to feel more love, they want to be more curious, they want to feel more carefree. And so the emotion that we're projecting into 2027 is what's called whitherwill. And it's the idea that consumers really want to be kind of free of responsibility. They want to be those kind of carefree beings that are able to enjoy and less stressed. So I'm going to go through a few examples of how in the fashion industry and outside of the fashion industry, brands are tapping into that to hopefully ignite some creativity for yourselves. So Nanushka, they've developed their store design to be very carefree and almost create a sense of calming in that. And I think that's really interesting in the fashion space. Not only do we see it in the essence of some collections, but in a lot of retail design, we see people designing for this idea of being carefree, stress-free, and allowing for moments of connection. Jumping over to a little bit, it's also linked to curiosity. So when we think of this idea of we see a lot of new products hitting the market, and it's almost an adaptation of a collision of forces of different cultures. So this is an Australian brand called Sorry Nonna, and it tips kind of the traditional tomato pasta sauce on its head by integrating some Korean spices. I can't say the name, but it's almost like a spicy addition. And I love this effect of the brand because it really just is a connection within societies and cultures. And then the last thing that I just want to touch into in this idea of society and kind of everyone coming together is personalization. So we see this as a huge trend, especially in the beauty space, but it's also hitting in fashion and innovation. And one way to tap into that is through 3D printing. So This is an Italian bike seat brand, and they actually use 3D printing to design a personalized bike seat. So you can see, obviously, in the fashion industry that comes through, but it's the use of technology to create kind of personalized products. Going into the sense of whitherwill and having less responsibility from society, this also has applications in the medical space. So it's interesting if you think about what different applications are, but the University of Nottingham has actually created a way to 3D print pills so that you can have all of your medications in one. So you can just see how that connection is between consumer desires and what they need and the application across different industries. Here are some ideas that you can think about in terms of embracing community. We've talked so much about community and connection, but that's definitely an important way to connect with consumers into 2027 from a societal perspective. Now we move into technology. Obviously, AI is huge, and everyone probably interacts with it on a daily basis. But 82% of consumers, they really express the desire to learn more about AI, kind of the good and the bad. Consumers and global CEOs, they see it as a force for good, but they're also aware of the negative aspects of this. How does that affect our emotions, and what emotion will we see attached to this sentiment around technology? In 2027, we're linking it towards suspicious optimism. So there are obviously good things that we can do if we integrate technology into our society, but it also has to be wise, trusted, to avoid the fear around it. Some examples of this, in Japan, it's really interesting. Obviously, some certain Asian markets, especially Japan, they're seeing a decline in fertility rates and also marriage rates. So the government has actually developed and is invested in a dating app that's using AI to help match in Japan, so to kind of combat that effect in society, which is really interesting and kind of a positive way to use AI to connect people. We also see this in fashion, where there's a technology brand called Future Footwear Foundation, and they're working with indigenous culture designs in India, and they're developing a technology which is a 3D printed footwear that essentially gives the impact of walking on the ground with it and walking barefoot. So you can see that there's some nice kind of collision between indigenous practices and technology coming through. And finally, this one is reminiscent of a Black Mirror episode that I watched probably about 5 years ago. But there's actually a company called Hereafter AI, and it's a tool that uses AI to actually collect images and voices and moments to essentially, once people have passed, kind of create the living memory and the essence of them for people to help deal with grief. So you can see kind of linking to some of these emotions around suspicious optimism. You see people having the desire to connect with technology in a new way and having creative applications of that. So there's ways that you can lean on tech to combat that IRL loneliness, but equally also integrate the ancestral intuition into technology to create new products such as the footwear design. Next, we go into environment, and obviously climate change is huge. Yesterday it was very hot, so if anyone needs a reminder of climate change, you're probably outside yesterday. But 56% of global consumers say that they think about climate change daily or weekly. So it's definitely on the mind of consumers, and it's definitely something that's triggering fear. What does that create from an emotional perspective? It's the idea and the need for resilient adaptation. So today we see people are really kind of helpless for this climate change. What do they do? And the emotions that they want to feel courageous, they want to feel safe, and resilient adaptation is a way to feel that. So what's really nice is if we look at this idea of resilient adaptation into architecture, this is a building in Bangladesh, and it looks at how office buildings are changing in their design. So this essentially brings the outside in. It's very sustainable. It's kind of low energy buildings, and actually the workers in this building have reported to be much more happier as a result of this connection to nature. So I think that's an interesting application of just this idea of adaptation in the architectural space. When we look at fashion and the need for resilient adaptation, obviously in Japan, I believe it's on TikTok, it's quite viral at the moment, but the look at Japanese construction workers and the air conditioning that they have built into their jackets. So Meanswile is a brand that has actually taken that technology and adapted it to their fashion brand. So looking at how they can adapt in the climate space. And finally, Christopher Bellamy, if we're looking at resilient adaptation and also connecting to nature, this is a wetsuit designed to be used for night swimming, and it actually taps into the algae, which glows at night, and is kind of integrated into the product. So it works with nature to create this wetsuit design. So when we think about ways to be creative and design related to the environment, look at how you can design into ecosomatics, challenge nature's theory of reciprocity, and kind of work in unison with nature. When we look at politics, and I don't want to turn this into a political conversation, but obviously a lot of shifts have happened in the political space. And I think we talked a little bit about, even in the panel, kind of the idea of inside and outside the circles. But I love this quote and this essence, because it says, when you need to make a circle wider and let more people in, you step back. And that doesn't leave you out of the circle, it makes your circle bigger. And I think that's such a sentiment of hope and kind of openness to actually make space for different people to create that kind of wider we. What did I do? So if we look at emotions related to politics and just in our day-to-day, given the rise and the shifts and kind of instability in the political space, we're seeing a higher incidence of people reporting anger. So 22% people said they felt anger a lot of the day yesterday, which is quite concerning. Hopefully we're not angry today. And 53% of people that say that they live in countries where freedom of expression is deemed to be in crisis. So I think a lot of these spaces and these pressures are changing how people behave in the political space. Again, kind of if we look at what people are experiencing now, they're experiencing kind of rage, concern, and they want to feel empowered, they want to feel unified and respected. So the emotional state that we're projecting in 2027 is this idea of civic hope, kind of coming together to create a more hopeful society. If we look at kind of places where that's coming in, there's a lot of innovation in that. And again, we see kind of the collision of culture and innovation coming through. So Greyhound Original is a fashion brand that's collaborating with agricultural farmers, and they're working to create their products and their designs from agricultural waste. So you can see how that kind of hope of channeling waste, kind of creating a better future together is important and being witnessed in fashion brands. We also see brands like this, which is Jenny Kramer, and this won the Rimowa Innovation Design Award, and it's actually clothing that taps into your somatic pulse points and pressure points in your body. So if anyone has kind of looked into that practice, you can actually de-stress yourself by pushing different acupressure points. And this is a fashion brand that has actually developed that to have it so you wear it in the day and kind of influence how you feel. So it's quite an innovative application that can change your emotions and your behavior throughout the day. And then finally, I love this brand activation, and it's quite obscure, but linked to that moment of people feeling a heightened rage and pressure. Mista in New York, they created essentially a rage space, so it was part of their pop-up, and they created an office where people could essentially go in and just break everything and kind of release their rage. So I love that this is such a reflection of how people are feeling today, and it also kind of accepts that we are humans, we are experiencing a lot of emotions, and again, taps into that cultural narrative. So if you think about it, explore the tensions and nuances, break taboos, kind of think about what people are experiencing in the political space and how you can reflect that back to everyone. We have two more, industry and creativity. So from an industry perspective, there's a lot going on, and especially in the fashion industry, there's new things that we need to navigate in the coming years. So if we look at the global financial crisis, the pandemic, the powerhouse, how things are transforming, there's a lot of kind of trust, suspicion, and risk, but now people are shifting towards de-risking. They want stability in the world. They want stability in their lives. So what is that influencing in how they behave? And if we look at COVID and what happened in COVID, a lot of people were watching kind of films that they had seen before. They were going back into nostalgia. And it's this idea that it's what you know is safe. And 57% of consumers have said that they want their country to be like it was in the past. So people are feeling uncertain and that also nostalgic. In the future, they want to really feel that sense of fulfillment, desire, and a new dynamic. So into 2027, the emotional state that we're seeing is shared vigilance. Kind of together, we're looking at how we can be safer. If we look at what's happening in the world, and this is a bit of an alternative example, but to preserve our futures, we see a lot of innovations, and one of them is the Critical Seed Library. And this is an initiative that's being developed to essentially preserve and protect species of seeds that are going to be extinct. So it's this idea that everybody's coming together to kind of protect our future. This is Vitelli, and they're a sustainable knitwear brand, and they've developed their fashion practices, but also have developed 2 different documentaries to essentially show their ethical fashion practices and spread that message and that voice. And this is a platform to essentially build those sustainable practices within the fashion industry. Obviously, I'm aware that this is not the only one. There are plenty of sustainable fashion brands, but this is one that's really interesting from their content creation perspective. And finally, Hermès, they have been leading in the luxury space, the industry that is obviously seeing a lot of turmoil recently. But they launched a school to essentially preserve the artisanal practices of making of their goods. So that's essentially also a way for us to tap into nostalgia, but share that knowledge and share those artisanal practices so that they don't get lost. So things to think about: design into the desire to gatekeep. And I think this is, again, a trend that we're seeing across industries, but in a wider space. We're seeing a reversion back to gatekeeping. Before it was, you shouldn't keep everything shared, but now people do want to see things a bit hidden. They want that exclusivity. And I think that also speaks to kind of Dior's strategy of the close friends list. They want that kind of closed space a little bit. And then also another piece that speaks to this is looking at archive building and archive mining. So linked to nostalgia and people going back to things, definitely look at what's in the archive and what can be familiar to consumers. And now, finally, we end on creativity. And this is one that's really close to my heart because I think it's super important, but it's this power of play. And when we look at psychologists, really play is key to brain development and creativity as a whole. Obviously, the fashion industry is so playful, so creative, and that's where a lot of these ideas come from. So it's important to bring those skills into your daily life for cooperation and conflict resolution, kind of in business and relationships. 96% of business leaders believe that creative ideas are essential to an organization's long-term success. So it's definitely something that we need to preserve in the industry and beyond. And what is essential to creativity and to play is this idea of strategic joy. So people are increasingly bored, stressed, dysregulated in their day-to-day life. And into 2027, we see this idea of strategic joy as an emotion becoming super important. And that allows us to be more inspired and included. A few examples of this coming to life. I thought this was such a brilliant activation, but it's called the Multi-Generational Playground. And if you think, there's so many in Berlin, but kind of playgrounds, the kindergartens, etc., you pass by them and they're often excluded for kids. And maybe sometimes you'll try to squeeze into a swing. But this is super interesting because it's a multi-generational playground to kind of encourage people to step out of their age and their roles. This is from Team Labs, which I'm not sure if any of you have been to that, but they have a lot in Asia. And they actually just opened this one in Abu Dhabi. And it's essentially a home of infinite curiosity. And I love that sense of being an infinite curiosity space. I mean, Fashion Week, I'm sure a lot of you have had curiosity, creativity, but including more spaces like this is essential to building creativity in the next few years. And then finally, if we think of brands and creativity in fashion, we're seeing new collaborations come up. I mean, Heiko talked a little bit about the power of sports, and we're seeing a lot of different sports coming up into the scene and having more popularity. So definitely Muay Thai. This brand, Yokao, they've created collaborations with Muay Thai athletes. And so you see different sports coming up and different forms of play entering the streetwear space. So different things like this, just one key takeaway for this is to essentially embrace the right to play and the need for play, and also encourage that in yourselves. As we go through just a summary, and this is the end, but I'd love for you just to think about some of these emotions that you've experienced or want to experience more of, and just also think about the relationship of how your emotions drive your behavior, because essentially that is the root of understanding consumer mindsets and creativity as a whole. That's it for me. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great Fashion Week.